I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello and welcome
everybody.
to Arcane Mark. On today's show, we're talking about multi-GM campaigns, where you run a campaign that uses more than one GM.
So, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, and one of the ways that we were thinking about organizing this is sort of with both space and with time.
Space, time, and the role of the other GMs. The GMs past the first GM, essentially. And you may not have a distinguishing feature between any of them. So, space and time are usually independent of each other, unless you're in a warp of space and time. Whereas the role of the other GM is actually usually dependent on space and time somewhat. So we're going to talk about different GM roles maybe first, and then bring up which of those roles, as we go through every space-time combination, we bring up which of those roles that we talked about work for those combinations.
So first of all, there's the role where, everybody has like equal control over the story and the setting whenever they are in the role of GM.
So in that role, basically you have a rotating GM.
Yes.
So a rotating GM, which as we'll see is part of, only really works if you're doing it across different times, is you switch out who's GM, and either their character is gone during the time that they're GMing, or somebody NPCs them, possibly the GM at the time. And then you just switch back and forth between different GMs and rotate them with the same group in generally the same campaign, although maybe each GM has their own plot thread that they're going through that interweave or something like that. So that is one possible way to use multiple GMs, where they're each equal and they're not necessarily even working together.
Then you can have a system where you have sort of you have a division of the typical GM roles among multiple people. So you might have somebody who is responsible for designing some aspects of the story and the characters and then somebody who's like, okay, now I'm going to be the one who runs things primarily in the combat.
Right.
And the extent to which the responsibilities are shared is going to vary from table to table. You're going to more commonly see like a somewhat lighter version of this, where the GM might ask like one of the players to run some of the monsters or the creatures at the table to help things go smoothly when you have big encounters or things like that, or to assist with things like tracking the initiative or other necessary tasks.
So in this case where you have co-GMs, you can have it where they're sort of equal in coming up with ideas and just they divide the tasks, or you can have it where there's sort of one main GM and that GM is, like Linda was saying, assigning tasks to sub-GMs who are not really the main GM, but they're like, okay, your task is, this NPC is really important, I want you to play that NPC. Like, almost like a PC, really, but except you're playing that NPC for role-playing and in combat. Or you'd be like, okay, they're going into this other side room over there where you're going to have a discussion with the queen, and I want you to run the queen in that discussion while I stay with everyone else over here. So there's many ways in which they can be a council of equals when you have multiple GMs that are running the same game, and there's ways in which one can be the main GM and one can sort of be a minion.
A major consideration on that is of that structure is how does the flow of information work between those GMs? Are there things that those GMs keep secret from each other?
That's right. And are there times that one of them is going to have to go to the other to check on something before they continue? Or is there at least some section of the game that they're currently running that they have carte blanche to do whatever they want, and it's not going to clobber over anything
You're
else?
more often going to see the things where there's less direct communication whenever you're doing more of a rotating GM style, where, for example, you might have, like, this mega dungeon is the purview of this one GM who's running it, and everything that happens in there is stuff that she's working on, whereas,
When they go back to town, their problems with the local thieves guild are
being run by the other GM. So you have like a group that's moving back and forth between different concrete sections that are well divided out.
Right.
One of which is under the purview of one GM and one of which the other.
So now that we've discussed rotating GMs, like co-equal GMs and like minion GMs, let's go into the space versus time axis. So there is same space, same time. In this case, all the GMs are there, you're all at the same table, and you're running different aspects of it right alongside each other. Now, you're allowed to break off the GMs and go to different rooms in the same way that if you had one GM, you might pull someone aside from the rest of the group, leave them all to their own devices for a few minutes and go off to another room and whisper something.
Yeah.
You can split the GMs in the same way, but generally in a same place, same time, you're not planning on splitting the GMs most of the time. They're generally all or both or all there at the same time at the same table,
yes.
running their own aspects, running their own separate NPCs. If it's a big encounter, running like maybe one of them runs the demons and one runs the hobgoblins, who are not necessarily completely allies but are all attacking the PCs.
Yes. And another thing with that too is that some of the things that fall under these are things that GMs do in some RPGs fall under these are things that players do in others, in terms of like coming up with aspects of the story or like introducing complications or challenges and things like that. So what the definition of a GM's role is going to depend upon your game. And if you're more accustomed to a game where more things are in the hands of the players, then it may be more natural for your group to say, hey, let's take more of these things that this more GM focused game says are GM purview and move them into things that the players do as well.
Absolutely. And so basically you can divide things any possible way when you're dealing with same place, same time, and you can change on the fly how you're dividing it based on how the players react and where there's a lot of load. In the same way as a computer with multiple processors could try to like divide the load evenly among the different processors, you can divide things among the GM on the fly. It's good to know in advance certain areas that someone is an expert in or is ready to handle, but that's not something that you need to absolutely have like done a giant flow chart of in advance.
Yeah. And to identify if there are certain things that one GM's like, I want to do something with this particular organization in the future, so like please don't introduce any major secrets or events with them because I have plans for them. So that way, like, you don't, like, step on each other's toes.
That's true in almost any of these.
Yes.
And it's actually probably more problematic in some of the other variations than that, but it's absolutely true here as well.
I think it should be mentioned here as well.
Yes.
That, like, having a clear sense of what are the things that, like, one of the GMs wants to be like, yeah, I have a plan for this. Please don't do X with Y.
So especially if the GMs collaborated to create like some kind of a setting Bible with a bunch of material, the GM who came up with an idea is not necessarily having like some major plans for that idea sometime later. So it's important to put a marker on certain features that you are definitely going to use. And for example, like Linda and I had a campaign setting that we made for one game, and we each put markers on certain NPCs or organizations that was like, I know what's going on with this this person, or I have something that's going on with them. I don't let's not do like an independent other thing going on with them that might be contradictory.
Yeah.
And so we had like one character who Linda always played, one who I always played, and the main instigator of most plot lines whoever wasn't GMing was playing. Yes.
It's because they were one of those characters who was just always going to jump in and bite the plot hook and major conspiracy theorists and things like that. So I think we're moving, we keep kind of sidling into the rotating GM stuff. So why don't
let's
we talk
move
a bit
to
about
same
rotating GM?
One table, but different across time. That's the rotating GM. So we've sidled into it because the rotating GM even more needs you to put like a marker on a particular plot or character, because at the table with multiple GMs, it's maybe too chaotic to notice this, but as long as you're paying enough attention and someone starts saying something about one of the NPCs, you can be like, wait, time out, and then bring the GM to the other side and say,
by the way,
hold on,
I've been laying
I have a
clues
thing,
for this
and
thing,
I'm planning on that to be like a demon cultist, so
Mhm.
let's not do the thing that
Yeah.
looks like you're about to do. Whereas if it's rotating GMs and like
You may not realize that
you
someone's
may
building
not
up toward another
realize
plot if you didn't
until
hint it.
halfway through a mystery adventure
Mhm.
that that person was being shown to be like secretly good, who was supposed to be
Yeah.
a demon cultist. And they just hadn't seen any of your clues from the other adventures, and we're now GMing, and like part of the way through adventure, you're like, oh wait, is this person secretly good? Because this is a problem, and I will have to spoil some of the things I've been doing throughout the entire campaign to tell you. So if you put a marker
Mhm.
on it in advance, it's easier to prevent things from getting out of control.
But I would say then though that if you are doing a rotating GM campaign, there is a greater degree of flexibility needed. So you can put pins on like a few things here, like these are major things that I'm working on, and then leave things a little more loose and flexible about some of the other things. So that if someone does go in and do thing XYZ with something that you were doing, and also like if one of the other GMs introduces something during a session as being like a significant thing, then gets good courtesy to check with them and make sure like, hey, you introduced this major NPC, like, is it cool if I have them be involved in like some other plot, or do you have plans for them?
Right. And so try to put a marker on a small minority of characters and elements instead of being like, yes, I've contributed, each of us 3 GMs have contributed 1/3 of the setting Bible, and of the 33% I contributed, 30 out of 33 I have markers on. There's this other 3% you can use. It's like, well, that's probably an issue because that's like a significant amount of the setting that nobody can touch, and it's going to make plot lines harder to tell. So you definitely want to be flexible on that. When you're rotating as a GM, you also have to think about different courtesies that you can give. You know certain things about the plot from what you're GMing that this GM may actually not know. And it may actually be relevant in some ways, even if they're not trying to use your plot line, just because something from your plot line could come up. So think about ways in which your world knowledge should be expressed. If you're like, I have a thing from like when I was GMing that's relevant here. Like, find a way to courteously in your social contract be able to talk about that, or make a rule that you can't talk about that. Figure out what that is in advance so that nobody is going to get surprised when something like that
because
comes
it could be something that you didn't think about. Like, maybe you had a plot line that was about like, a particular type of spirit that comes out whenever there's a strong rainstorm, but you didn't think to say like, oh, if there's don't make a strong rainstorm or whatever, and then there's a strong rainstorm, and then you're thinking like, well, wait a minute,
this would have come out. Yeah, exactly. So sometimes it's like they're not trying to use an element that you like flagged for a major NPC. It's just like some weird world
you realize,
setting
oh wait,
thing.
this is the thing. If this happened, then this would also happen. And so
Exactly.
like, do you say, do you like tell the GM like, hey, based on call them to side and be like, based on something that I'd set up, like, there's a thing that the characters might notice going here. It's not going to be like a major point, but it'll be an important clue for later.
Yep.
And then
so you figure out how to do those communications,
because you don't want it to like
derail.
You don't want it to like derail their stories. So
right,
having like some kind of a sign or clue that people, and also then the rest of the players will know, hey, if it's in your social contract that like when those kinds of things come up, everybody knows, yeah, that's not the adventure for the GM who's GMing today, but it's just like a little hint and teaser we can follow up on later. Let's not all jump off of the current GM's adventure to investigate this side thing.
Exactly. So you're going to need to be a little flexible about that, and especially if your multiple GMs don't have a good agreement on certain other social contract thing where you don't have to have an agreement where everybody runs things exactly the same because every GM has their own style. But if they're very different and it's a shared character and setting, it can be a little problematic sometimes. So you want to figure it out. If one of them is like Monty Hall and is constantly dropping 20th level items in your Pathfinder 2 game and you're level 3, this will affect everybody.
Yeah, so the other person is trying to do like a gritty survival or whatever. So you need to make sure, like, especially in the session 0 of a collaborative campaign like that, what are the expectations in terms of like variations from the rules, as well as this like that would be an example of like a variant rule that's going on almost if you're saying you're dropping that much more. What are the expectations for like the theme and the tone and things like that for the campaign?
Right. Also, if there's certain rules element where like one of the GMs is allowing like pre-errata black tendril shot and the other GMs all don't want to allow it. Like, does that just mean you wait and you shoot it during that GM session and it's more powerful then? And what about if you have something like Winter's Sleep, where technically, like, you win when you put up Winter's Sleep, but, like, that's probably not what it's supposed to do. And if you don't have all the GMs who've agreed upon what it's supposed to do, then you might wind up in a situation where they take it and it's a feat, unlike Black Tendril Shot, and it literally just wins the encounters because everybody stops at the edge of the aura and then falls. If in one GM's group and like is only mildly powerful battlefield control for everybody else, and it's a feat you can't just retrain only when you're in with that one GM. So there's a lot of situations where rulings, they don't have to match up between the GMs, but if they don't, it can actually lead to a little bit of whiplash where the character is different between them. So it's better if they do, or if the GMs can agree, look, we can't agree on a ruling, let's just not allow this one.
Yeah. And this point is going to come up a lot too in the sort of multi-GM, different place type discussions that you have in things like organized play, for example.
Should we move on to multi-GM, multiple tables?
I have some more thoughts on this one, but I think let's move on to that for now, and then we can circle back.
Okay.
So yeah, like with the whole thing about like, you know, additional resources and clarifications and things like that, because it can be very disruptive if a player has something that is interpreted one way at one table and a completely different way at another table.
So is this is different in space and different in
space
time.
and time, yes.
Yes.
Because in this case, because you're different in space and time, you can't then sit down with your other GMs and have a conversation.
Right. This is basically organized play.
This is basically organized play.
And in this one, the GM is like the organized play head, and everyone else who's running the games are like the minion GMs who are running individual games, because whoever's the head is like the main GM who is making the big calls, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, where you can have a very equal part or you can have an unequal distribution.
And it's more different too depending upon like what you're doing, because if you have like everyone's in a different place, and then you have that lack of communication, so you have to have things set up front about like, okay, you know, that when goes ahead and sets into place, what are the rules about consumables? What are the rules about, like, access to everything? What are the rules about clarifications for certain things? How do you level up? What are the house rules, et cetera, et cetera? And that's all put up into play up front. And then organized play also has the example of, you know, many GMs same place, and things like organized play specials.
So that...
which are...
all of them are many gems, but what you're saying for that one is the last combination, which is same time, multiple places. Multiple tables.
Sorry. Same time, multiple places. Yes, apologies, I misspoke.
But that is a multi-table special.
Yeah. You know, multiple places, same time, where you're working together and you have synchronization. And for that, you really need people who are responsible for actively organizing and managing communication and tracking between the tables that are working together. You
really need a structure with oversight where there's some infrastructure team, depending on how big it is, that everybody reports up to, even if that infrastructure team isn't, or this overseer GM isn't more in charge of like the actual decisions of what's running. If you're not a multi-table PFS special and you're just like a home group that has lots of things going on, even if they aren't more in charge, you need a central location, because if you don't have a central clearinghouse, it's going to be very difficult to keep up communications among tables where all the GMs are running independently and expected to communicate with each other. It's just too much for one person. And it could
be the same place in the sense of the same virtual place. Like everyone's playing online at the same time and has a central communication clearinghouse. Like
yes, in terms of what the clearinghouse is.
Yeah.
For these multiple places that are or multiple tables.
Multiple tables, yeah. They don't have to be like in the same physical spaces, yes, but they are going to have some kind of a connection.
And they could be very close to each other. But the idea is there are multiple tables. It's not like considered to be the same group
Yes, it's not the same group.
necessarily. Or if it is the same group, they're playing separately in a certain way. So those are the four central splits, which are same location at same time, different location or different tables at a similar location, same time. Then there is different location, different time.
Yes.
Yep. And then there is same location.
Same location, different time.
Different time.
We did it in a different order than we just said.
That was a different order than what we said.
Yeah.
But the same location, different times, or which doesn't actually have to be the exact same location, but the idea is there's one location.
Same group.
Yes, it's the same group. There's one location that they're at, but they go to different times, and you have different GMs.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to organized play, a lot of the considerations of like how to make that work structurally are more on that organizer and the campaign creation side, rather than like the side of the GMs who are running individual tables. Other than like as a GM in that, like being understanding of those sorts of constraints and the facts that people are going to have different interpretations as a GM or a player, and being willing to like be flexible in the way that you approach things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is important for
That's
for the
why
quality
there's
of
a
the experience.
centralized decision making body for like a lot of those big decisions, and it's at the top. It's not at the bottom necessarily. So, but you can have a decentralized structure, especially for a home group. And especially if it's small, where just everybody kind of gets together and does a council and decides things. The bigger you get, the harder that is to pull off.
Yeah, I think that like in terms of what GMs are more likely to be working with and like troubleshooting on their end, like the multiple GMs for the same table is probably like the most convoluted in that way, and the one that's like most interesting to discuss.
The one with multiple GMs, same time, same table.
No, like when you're the rotating
rotating,
GM, the
different
rotating
time,
GM,
same
yeah,
table.
the rotating GM system where you got the same table and you're trading off the GM responsibilities.
It's the hardest because of the fact that you are assumed to be not the GM for some of the time and be a normal player during the time that you're not the GM.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to talk about with that is you mentioned that, that people may have different styles with the way they run, but people also may have different, like, amounts of the time that they run. Because even if this doesn't have to be a 50-50 type of thing, and it can be a really cool thing to give people who don't GM that often a chance to just try out running something for a session, And if you want to give someone a chance to try running something for a session that's part of the game, you can consider making a sort of like side story or bottle episode type thing where it's like, the same PCs as normal, like, got sucked into a magical rift and now they're suddenly in a hero card demi-plane. Or they're
Wandering Mage had an idea in chat where they try to get their players, they're the normal GM, to play Dungeon Ancestry, and then each session someone would run their inner dungeon for the group.
Oh, that sounds cool.
And we're the GM for that, but their players were too nervous and it failed.
That's a shame. That was a
exactly
great idea.
like what you were saying about having some people who were not normally the GM take special consideration and do some kind of
and
bottle
if your players are down for that, doing it that way helps too, because it means that you're not going to have the expectation of the same NPCs and the same features, so that they can so you have the continuity of like the characters are the same. But then, so you might do something with that too, because then the question is like, okay, well, the person who is almost always the GM doesn't necessarily have a character here. But then what you could do, for example, is maybe then the GM, the temporary GM gives an NPC to the usual GM and is like, here's someone who's traveling with a group for this session.
Absolutely.
Here's their deal. And
like the Dungeon Ancestry's extra dimensional dungeons are kind of perfect for this, because there's just no way that any of the things that the primary GM is dealing with are going to show up in that extra dimensional dungeon. So it's pretty self-contained and is easy for the temporary GM to just run and explore themes of their character, and that way you can more interestingly involve people with your 10-page backstory that you had for your character by showing it in the dungeon instead of telling it.
Yeah, you can also do ones that are side stories that have different characters but are part of the same general campaign arc. So it might be like you know, that one of that, like, it's not like super critical to the plot for like the primary GM, exactly like how some other group of NPCs who's very significant to their story came together, and then the other GM's like, yeah, I want to tell the story of like what was it like about how this group adventuring group that we as now our rivals came together or something like that, and then you can see it from the other side.
Are you saying that Mightiest Dragon versus the Treacherous Ape was not super critical to the plot, Linda?
Yes. Mightiest Dragon versus the Treacherous Ape was a random side story in the Skull and Shackles
game
campaign
that
I was running,
and I ran the side story where one like the familiar of one of the characters thought that the other familiar of one of the other characters was stealing from him again, his hoard again, and it was actually gremlins.
Yes. And the way we did that is Mark is like, yeah, I have an idea for a story, like, it's not necessarily canonical, but I think it'd be fun, and it was awesome. And afterwards I was like, canon, that 100% happened. And then I had that half happen between that last session and the next one, and then there was conversation where some of the NPCs were talking about, like, what just happened and their own interpretations of what was going on. It's like, Pontus, are you causing problems again? It's like, no!
I saved the ship, ye!
And the PCs each took the sides of their respective familiars, and it was funny.
Yep. So, it looks like David Nielsen says that he tried to multi-GM and it worked for a while, but they aren't able to communicate together with the other GM enough, and it ended up with a bit of a lovely corpse.
I imagine that means that it just kind of fell apart and didn't.
Like, communication in the rotating multi-GM is the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
And it is exceptionally challenging, and I've heard a lot of stories about things that, like, don't mesh right or that have some kind of an issue. And so you do need to work hard at actively communicating to get that to work. And you could have ways of going about it. For example, in the campaign that I was talking about with Linda, although we like eventually stopped playing that for years, but we had an idea that would help, which was that not only did we put markers on certain things, but we had like an idea for seasons, where in the first season, one person would tell the A plot that was like the main thing that were more connected to each other, and the other person was doing like Monster of the Week episodes that were like the ones in between, because in your season of your TV show, not everything is connected to the main plot line. Some of them are just some other thing that's happening.
Yeah.
And then we would switch, and the other person would be in charge of the main plot in the next season, and the first person would go to do it, filling in those little random like one-off.
Yeah, we didn't wind up really ultimately getting into that as much.
We almost finished the first season.
And then life happened.
Yeah, where I was the one who was running the main plot line, and
I remember I had some ideas. I had some ideas for the second season, and then just like a lot of stuff happened, and then you know how it is. You don't play the game for a while, and you're like, wait, what was I doing? And then you try some other game, and that's just the cycle of things.
The cycle of games.
Indeed. But I did really like that idea, and I think it could work very well.
I think so too. It just, by setting roles, limitations, and always actively communicating, is easier to not run into a problem.
And one of the nice things about that season idea too is, like, I knew, well, you know, this group of NPCs is going to be pretty important to the season plot, because you put a giant marker on them, and my characters don't know that.
One of the people I put a marker on was not in season 1, a huge thing. They were probably going to be in season 3.
Fair enough. I have the really scary one.
I don't know which one you're talking about.
I'll figure it out later.
If you mean the one that was constantly that got hit by a rocket launcher, then I would say that
one showed up a lot.
She was not someone I put a marker on, because she was clearly the BBG of one of the adventures that I was in, rather than like a background plot element.
Fair enough. I was like, was she gonna stick around? Because she seemed like she was gonna be really hard to defeat for real. Anyway, this is neither here nor there.
So, I think that at this point we've gone through the different roles that each of the GMs can play, and the sort of the matrix of space and time the space-time continuum.
So
for
I
the
want to
different
see if
GMs.
Chad has any questions
Because multiple people in chat have talked about when they tried to do this and had it not necessarily
or thoughts
work.
or things like that about the.
And then I will, while you're getting the questions, I will talk about one more thing, because
one more thing.
Yes, where Linda like sometimes accidentally said several GMs when she met like several locations or several times.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a multi-GM campaign thing that can actually make that like not a redundant statement, where in this one table, one GM. Why is this in multi-GM campaigns? 2 groups.
Mm-hmm.
So you could do it where you're the GM for 2 separate groups, and you do a crossover adventure where you are all of the GMs, and just your groups are both there at the same time, and everybody comes, and you do some kind of crossover. The problem is that is probably going to be really hard to run without getting an assistant, so that could be a situation where you still wind up with multiple GMs, because you ask for someone to be a deputy from each of the 2 groups to help you.
And when we did that, like, I think it really we had like this giant combat, and there's like 15 PCs in the combat. I think like one of the main reasons it worked is that it was 2 campaigns that had like about the same set of players, so a lot of people were
there was a crossover. About 50% of people were in both.
So then those people had multiple characters, and so they had like multiple turns per round.
Yes, and of the people who were in both, I think that like one from each group had a character who was like kidnapped by the people that they were attacking, so that they then had one character who wasn't kidnapped.
Yes, so everyone had at least one character to play.
It all worked out.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. While I was telling that story about multi-GM campaigns that you can sort of do with one GM, it looks like we don't have any other questions from chat. There's one. Interestingly, oddly seen one campaign where everyone was playing 2 characters. That was just the usual. That's something else you could do. That would not be the full GM Tools multi-GM campaigns, but it is a completely separate topic for how to deal with having a small number of players, other than doing some like trying to power up the characters but not getting it exactly right because of action economy.
It can also be
and death spiral.
It can also be done sort of a little more related to this. If the idea is that each one of those players has one character that's like, this is my primary character, and then each player also has like an NPC that they're responsible for playing. So instead of like a major NPC being played by the primary GM, it's like, okay, everyone gets one of these NPCs that they're playing for role playing and for battle. Here, I'm going to give each of you like the important backstory information about this NPC and their goals and motivations and secrets, and you can be the one to present that to everyone else.
Absolutely.
And it can even involve then using a rotating cast of NPCs that people are working with over time.
For sure. So, yeah, I think we quickly and efficiently we used our multi-GM campaign to divide and conquer and talk about how to deal with multiple GMs. Just, as always, in a lot of these videos, social contract is important, communication is important. Mm-hmm. Try to set up a multi-GM campaign with people you know and you get along with, and you can easily make decisions that you all respect with each other.
I'd recommend not setting a new one up if you haven't ever like played with the other GM before and don't have a sense of their style.
You need to make sure
your styles are compatible before you do that sort of thing.
And even if your styles are very different and one is more humorous and one is more serious, that can be fine, because you want to loosen up tension from the very serious stuff.
Yeah.
With a humorous campaign potential, or like a humorous adventure in between.
As long as they can work together.
Your decision-making process being something that will work together is more important than the tone of your game is being the same.
And that you're willing to work off of like at least a similar basis of rules and expectations.
Right. If one person is all about consistency and the other person is like rule of cool, rules out the window, that's going to be a bigger problem, even if they both have exactly the same vision for like what the world looks like and the fact that it's a gritty action movie style post-apocalyptic world, and they could quote their setting Bible to each other back and forth. But just the fact that one is all about consistency and the rules, and the other is about rule of cool, throw out the rules.
And then you look at things where, like in the story, and you know, in one of the GM sessions, you can do like people like are gonna bypass obstacles by ripping off a door and using it as an improvised sled and doing all this kind of stuff, and then like, well, who's GMing today? Oh no, wait, that doesn't work with this person. Like the kinds of stories that you get to Stone.
So like in last session, I was in trouble, so I ripped into the sky and tore off a piece of a god's concept so that I could become a demigod. Although unfortunately, in the next session, I died of dysentery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's basically it. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Oh, I do want to say one thing here.
You got one more.
I'm seeing in the comment here, one thing they did have was the universe was explicitly made from multiple worlds getting smashed together, so history was wrong. That's a really cool idea for like helping to paper over any little inconsistencies if there's a mess up if there's a reality distortion going on.
You can have
like
time travel for that too. It's like, oh, time got messed up.
Mm-hmm. Then if you have a good way to clean things up, if the multiple GMs realize that they've created inconsistency and they need to clean it up for the story to go forward.
Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. So, bye YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.